Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who have already joined the webinar, the Global Town Hall meeting with David Anderson Associates. A very warm welcome to all of you, and we hope that today's webinar and discussion will be tremendously helpful to you in your efforts to implement Kanban and lean processes within your organization, whether you're IT or a non-IT organization. As we get started, just a few requests. If you have already participated in an event like this in the past, then you probably are already familiar with the sort of ground rules. Have your questions ready, and the one thing that we're doing differently this time is that we will have our attendees also be able to speak out their questions on the microphone. So just ask for the microphone using the request mic icon that's visible to you, and we will go ahead and get your questions on as per the sequence in which the questions are asked. Just an initial introduction to the town hall. So we'll start with a basic, very simple agenda today. That we'll go with some introductions and a quick word from the sponsor, Digite, and then we'll quickly get on to the town hall meeting with the Q&A format, and at the end of that, we'll wrap it up. So with that, let me first of all go ahead and introduce the panelists. Our main speaker, of course, is David Anderson, President of David J. Anderson Associates, and of course, David, to most people, doesn't need a big introduction. But let me go ahead and, for those of you who may not know him very well, give a quick introduction. David is a thought leader and a pioneer in the field of lean Kanban for software development and managing effective software teams. He has over 25 years of experience in the software industry, starting with computer games in the early 1980s. He's led software teams delivering a great productivity and quality using innovative agile methods. David has written 2 books: Agile Management for Software Engineering, applying the theory of constraints for business results, and Kanban, Successful Evolutionary Change for Your Technology Business. David is also founder of the Lean Software and Systems Consortium, LSSC, which is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to promoting greater professionalism and better economic outcomes in our industry. And of course, he's the president and CEO of DJ Anderson Associates, which provides the consulting, coaching, and training services to organizations adopting Kanban and Lean methods for software development, DevOps, and IT operations. And last but not the least, we are very proud to have David as an advisor to Digité. He consults with us for overall product strategy, especially in the area of lean Kanban. Joining us in today's panel discussion is also Domenica De Grandes, Mike Burrows, and Janice Reed, who are associates with David Anderson at DJ Anderson Associates. Very warm welcome to the panel as well. I'm your host. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm co-founder and senior vice president of product at Digité, and Ram Subramaniam, who's the co-founder and VP sales at Digité. Before I open up the panel and let David have the microphone, just a quick introduction about Digité so that we can get that out of the way. We are a pioneer in web-based collaborative products solutions for geographically distributed teams, and that's really been our key tenet in terms of facilitating collaboration in the context of the project that you're doing. We are headquartered in Mountain View, California, and we support over 250,000 users in Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific, and we're getting customers in other parts of the world as well. Our products cover Lean Kanban, Agile ALM, and project portfolio management, and Swift-Kanban, Lean Kanban product. And we've, over the last several years, we've got recognition by various people, including Gartner, which has covered us in the ALM Market Scope report and other ALM documents. Just a quick smattering of the kind of customers that we have, which span a variety of industries and verticals. Typically, we are, working with customers that are either IT services or IT consulting or corporate IT, and you see a range of customers that we have across those industries. So with that, again, just a a pointer for people who are just joining that questions will be taken on air, so that you can speak the question, and in case David has clarifications, you can go ahead and ask for the clarifications. To the extent possible, we will try and group questions so that we're talking of relevant topics at one time. To begin with, we'll try and limit it to one question per attendee, per person who's asking questions. But if we have time later on, then we can certainly come back to other questions that you might have. And just so that you know, the webinar itself will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to all the attendees of the webinar. So with that, let me give you a very warm welcome to David Anderson. David, if you're ready, we can get started. And I thought that perhaps to start things off, we can, you can probably talk a little bit about sort of the state of the union on Kanban for software. Where do things stand, especially as we approach LSSC 2012, in next month in Boston, and as we come to the middle of 2012, we've had some interesting conversations with you, with our customers, and in other forums, and it's been fascinating to hear you talk about how the overall market is evolving for Kanban. So perhaps maybe you can start things off by talking about that.
Thank you, Mahesh. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Yeah, that's a good question. You're giving this audience the opportunity to hear much of what I'll be saying in my State of Kanban Land talk just after lunch on the 15th of May at the LSSC 12 conference in Boston next month. So this audience is getting the early scoop. First of all, it's always difficult to interpret information when we have such an uncertain economy. And it's very clear that particularly in Europe, the economy is tightening up, where despite what the government here in the United States is telling us, we're still seeing a lot of signs of uncertainty. And one of the ways we measure that is how early are people willing to commit to attending the conference. And to be fair, attendance this year, registrations this year have been coming in later than previous years. We're now at a point where I think we're ahead of last year in terms of registration with more momentum. So we're fully expecting the conference to have around 300, perhaps 330 people, which is a very small increase on last year. And we're also noticing some changes in the type of people registering and the types of registrations. For the previous 3 iterations of the conference, so that's 2009, 10, and 11, we've always offered corporate discounts to companies who would send 5 or more people. We never sold one. This year we've sold multiple of those, and one company is sending 11 employees. That's a large insurance and pension company from the United States. So what we're seeing really are signs that Kanban has entered what marketing people know as Moore's chasm, where the enthusiasts in the market are largely dropping out and being distracted to other new things for which they have a passion and enthusiasm, notably things like lean startup and gamification. And those people are being replaced by major corporate early mainstream market adopters. And we're really seeing a significant change in the market and the attendance. Overall, I think this is a very good sign. It's really quite good news to be able to say Kanban is in the chasm, because it shows that it's growing up and that the market is developing. And I fully expect really a mainstream market to emerge in 2013. And we're doing a number of things to encourage that mainstream adoption, not least of which is the development with Lean Kanban University announcing an accredited Kanban training program with a defined curriculum and accredited trainers and member companies. Initially there were 18, and we have some applications pending, and we expect to announce at least 2 more member companies at the conference in Boston. And this will mean that accredited Kanban training is being offered in 4 continents and a total of around 20 countries. So that's very encouraging, and it demonstrates again a maturing of the market. One of the other ways that we measure it, and my firm is in a position where we get to know many of the vendors like Swift-Kanban making Kanban software, is we observe the nature of the licenses that those companies are selling and announcements from consulting firms or from customers who are adopting Kanban and buying licenses from tool vendors. And we've certainly seen a significant change. Over the previous 3 years, people were trying out, they were using free licenses and trying it with small teams. But recently we've seen a number of really quite significant announcements with licenses being sold with several hundred users, even 1,000 users in one example. And those licenses are being sold across a range of industries, banks, insurance companies, investment banks, petrochemical companies, federal and provincial governments, particularly in Canada, and 1 or 2 major consulting firms such as Digite and Atos Origin, leading really very significant Kanban initiatives with clients. And all of that is saying to me that Kanban is crossing the chasm and entering mainstream adoption. So while we're looking at conference attendance being relatively flat compared to 2011, there's really very significant signs that we're making a lot of progress, and I continue to be encouraged. We're also seeing a number of books appearing. There's a German language book by Klaus Leopold and a colleague of his. I've forgotten his full name, I apologize, Sigmund something. And also a book in French about to appear by Laurent Morisot. And just in the last couple of days, Belgian Nick Oostvogel's published a small book on Kanban. Henrik Nieberg's latest book has significant Kanban case study, or certainly use of Kanban within a significant case study for the Swedish police force. And therefore we're seeing a lot more literature appearing, and generally adoption is spreading around the world, and people are having real success. That this isn't just some fad. We're genuinely seeing it affect the profitability of businesses that are adopting it, and therefore I fully expect us to continue on this growth curve. Do we have some questions from the audience?
So before I go to the audience, David, thanks first of all for that great overview. I just wanted to clarify to the attendees that in case you have a question, you can raise your hand as well, and there's a raise hand icon that will also allow you to point to yourself, and then we can pass the microphone to you. In the meantime, I wanted to pass on the microphone to Domenica. Domenica, you have covered the DevOps side of affairs, and I've seen a number of your writings. Would you like to comment on how you've seen Kanban being adopted for DevOps, and where do you see it heading in 2012?
Hi, yeah, I'd love to comment on that. There's been several DevOps-based conferences recently where Kanban has seen a tremendous increase in interest. And I believe that's because in the DevOps movement, there is a lot of attention put on optimizing the whole versus just trying to optimize locally. in individual functions or individual silos. And with Kanban, we've been teaching some classes specifically for DevOps. We recognize that system design for an operations or IT services group can look very different than a design for software engineering or software development. And we look at some of the items that really plague IT teams in general and operations. We're looking at how to handle dependencies, how to handle specialization versus generalization. Boy, if you want to see a good heated debate between people, just go to a DevOps meetup and ask the question about generalization versus specialization. And there's a lot of hot discussion on that lately. We also deal a lot with variable task size. In a lot of the software designs, we see tasks that are fairly similar in size, but in operations, we have quite a wide distribution, quite a wide spread on task size. So there's a lot of interest in how to handle that. And I would say the fourth top item of concern in the DevOps movements that's related to Kanban is how do we handle all these interrupts? There's so much interrupt-driven work. And in many cases, that's just the nature of our business. And so we talk about how to design a system to handle those kind of interrupts at the same time that we are trying to reduce them. We are trying to reduce that variability so that we can be more predictable. What else could I mention? Do you have any other specific questions for me? Be happy to respond to questions, I guess, as they come up. Just let me know.
Okay, we will do that. But I guess again I want to clarify to all the participants that next to your name you will see a hand icon that allows you to raise a hand and ask for the mic. So please use that to go ahead and ask any question that you have. And while attendees are getting organized about asking questions, David, I wanted to go back to a very oft repeated question that we face when we're talking to customers, and which is about Scrum teams adopting Kanban. And this is a topic that you've spoken on often, but again, there is large attendance today where they might be hearing you for the first time. So the question about how do you move away from a very time box approach to something which is not so time box? How do you adopt Kanban if you are a Scrum team from the time boxing perspective? If you can talk a little bit about that, that would, I think, help the broader audience.
Thanks, Mahesh. So for those of you that are familiar with Scrum and using Scrum, or really let's call them first generation agile methods, of which Scrum has really become the predominant one in the market, almost all of those methods use the concept of a time box where there would be some agreed scope, some short period of time like 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks, and then some form of delivery to a customer at the end. And really what that's doing is it's coupling three ideas together. It's coupling the length of time it takes to develop a small batch of working software together with delivery to the customer and the opportunity for customers, often it's the plural, more than one stakeholder, for those customers to do some form of prioritization and interaction. And those three things all have the same cadence. If you have a 2-week long iteration, every 2 weeks the customers get to prioritize work. You spend 2 weeks trying to develop that work and make it functional, and then you deliver it to the customer every 2 weeks. And the introduction of a Kanban system allows you to decouple those three things so that they can have their own independent cadence. The enabling capability for that is to be able to do configuration management such that work in progress doesn't escape into the wild when you do a release. So there is a need to have some config management capability, and often that's done through some form of branching or labeling in a version control system. So if you have that capability, you are capable of implementing a Kanban system and decoupling customer interaction and delivery from the length of time it takes to design, develop, test a piece of software or a set of functionality. And that provides a tremendous amount of flexibility that can increase the agility of the business. There are certain industries that have become wide and extensive adopters of Kanban. The media industry particularly is a big Kanban adopter, and really one after another over the last 3 or 4 years I hear of big media companies that are well-known Kanban adopters. The BBC was obviously one of the first and best known, but other well-known public ones include Digite in Germany, Globo in Brazil, the Financial Times. There are a number of American ones, big brand name companies, and why does the media industry appreciate this decoupling of these cadences that the Kanban system allows? Well, world events do not unfold in nice time-boxed intervals of 2 weeks and 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So being able to interact with the business more often fits with their domain problem. There are some other aspects to time boxing that we notice, particularly with more mature products that are beyond version 1 or version 1.1. Once a product or a service is live in the market, the number of inputs creating demand increases. Before you launch a product, there's really only the product manager providing the demand, perhaps consolidating it from various other stakeholders in a business. But once a product's in the market, there might be demand from customers, demand from field sales, demand from customer care organizations who receive calls from unhappy customers. And while the product has to be developed and improved, there's also a lot of bug fixing and perhaps seasonal regulatory demand in various industries. Regulations are issued every year, for example, at a certain time of year, and the product has to be maintained in order to match with that. For example, payroll systems that have federal tax regulations changing every year. So once the product's in the market, the complexity of servicing the demand that's coming from multiple stakeholders is challenging, and the nature of that demand varies. Some of it has hard delivery dates that are outside the control of the organization. Some of it's very reactionary. Perhaps a severe defect is discovered by a customer and needs to be fixed in an expedite fashion. So Kanban systems allow that flexibility. With organizations that tend to stick to more traditional agile methods, the usual reaction to this increase in sources of demand and variation in the nature of the demand is simply to shrink the size of the time box, to go from 4-week iterations to 3 to 2 to 1. And as they do that, they find that the developers and the testers, particularly the testers, often complain that the time box is too short, that there isn't enough time to respond effectively. And at the same time, they struggle to analyze the requirements and to estimate the amount of work that they can do within these very short time boxes. The result is that the system comes under a lot of pressure, and really it begins to break down. They start breaking the agreements they made for the time box. They miss a lot of sprint commitments, and they start to believe that it's their fault, that the textbook told them that this would be okay, and yet it doesn't seem to be working for them. So they try even harder. They put more energy into their estimation and analysis. They try to learn new techniques to break down their user stories into ever smaller, more fine-grained increments that can be fitted into smaller time boxes. They get more and more elaborate with their estimation procedures and the mechanisms used to calculate exactly just how much could we get done inside a time box. And really what's happening there is that they're introducing more and more waste into their system, that actually they're devoting energy to planning rather than building software. And what we see over longer periods of time, and from time to time people send me this data. Relatively recently I saw data from a team in South Africa. It was spread over 2 years, and it showed a significant slowing down, a long-term 2-year trend where the velocity was gradually slowing. And there's a very likely explanation that as their product was maturing, they were spending more and more time on non-value added activities. Kanban systems free you from all of that, and yet the customer interaction doesn't change significantly. If you have a 2-week delivery cadence, just keep that 2-week delivery cadence. The customer continues to take deliveries every 2 weeks if you were working in 2-week sprints previously, but there's no longer this need for everything to fit into a 2-week time box. So from a customer perspective, you can design your Kanban system solution to meet their needs in terms of frequency of interaction and frequency of delivery, and yet you can free yourself from the tyranny of the time box.
Thanks, David. Yeah, again, and I think this is a question that we have faced almost continuously, because I think a lot of the people who are adopting Kanban are people who are already doing Scrum, and this becomes a common sort of concern, not only for the team itself but also for the a way to ask when can I get what, and that kind of throws them off a little bit as they start to get used to the principles of Kanban. And David, there's a question here from Michael Lopez, and Michael, I'm going to pass the microphone to you so you can ask your question online here. But this is related to the same topic, which is of an organization that's already adopting Kanban, and or I started using Kanban, and what do they now do with they've started adopting Scrum, I beg your pardon, and how do they start to look at Kanban as well? Michael, if you can speak into the microphone and ask your question, that'd be great. Michael Lopez, if you can hear me, you do have a microphone with you, so you can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. A little faint, but we can hear you.
Okay. Our organization is starting out with Scrum, and I told them about Kanban, and they're just kind of at the initial stages. I don't know how I can impress upon them, how important it is, and what would you do if you were starting with a clean slate, basically? Would you start with Kanban and then Scrum, or a mixture? Thanks.
Hi, Michael. Just a quick clarifying question. Can you describe what you mean by a clean slate?
Well, there are no agile processes at the moment on an enterprise level, so they're just, you know, going to have Scrum meetings starting and things like that, training.
But just to be clear, there is an existing software development or IT organization, and it does stuff and builds software and puts it in production and operates it. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Probably about 20 developers.
Right. So you have some form of existing processes that are just a little more traditional and perhaps not recognizable as agile.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I wanted to clarify that because I do sometimes get asked the greenfield question, which is, we're about to form a new organization and we're hiring 150 people, and should we use Kanban from the beginning? And that's a different question from the one you asked. I have a number of observations. There is a significant difference between Scrum and Kanban in a situation like yours. And it's perhaps unfair to pick on Scrum because we could pick on any first-generation Agile method or many other ideas that came before them. It's more to do with how you introduce the change. The Kanban method approach is to start with what you do now and to overlay on top of it a Kanban system and a visualization of your existing process. And really to change as few things as possible while certainly identifying sources of variability and dissatisfaction, such as the ones Domenico was describing earlier, and perhaps to try and design out some of those problems, but to do it in a way that doesn't affect anyone's role, responsibility, job title, or generally the technique and practices being used to actually do the analysis, design, development, testing. Those things tend to stay the same. The things that change are often the interaction points with external stakeholders or other groups on which you might have dependencies. So the Kanban approach is start with what you do now and introduce the change very gently by implementing a Kanban system, limiting work in progress, and improving the visibility onto the work and the process that the work flows through, the workflow. Whereas the approach with Scrum, or for that matter pretty much any other method that came before it, is to say whatever you're doing now isn't good enough and here's an alternative and you should adopt it wholesale and immediately, and if you do that, things will get better. And at an enterprise scale, my observation is that what happens with an approach like that is that there is a fairly large-scale resistance to adoption. That you can often get adoption on a few small teams, or you can get isolated pockets of adoption across an organization, but you can't institutionalize it without significant resistance. And there are a number of approaches to dealing with the resistance. The most popular one is to say, oh, just walk into the senior executive or chief executive's offices and get them to decree that this is the way forward, and provide their backing and perhaps hire a big consulting firm or a small consulting firm with lots of consultants who come in and coach people. And to some extent that's coercion. It's making it clear that there's a new norm expected and people need to fall into line with it. Recently I was doing research for my new book, which will be published next month, and during that I discovered an old blog post that I'd written in 2003, which linked a blog post written by one of my staff at the time. a programmer who worked on my team, and he wrote a very long blog post explaining how easy it was for developers to passively, aggressively resist management imposed changes. And he itemized a number of really quite detailed ways in which he could really undermine the change initiative and undermine the quality of our code base without really being spotted. And therefore, there's always a risk that when you try to impose change on people, particularly with something as intangible as software development, that you kid yourself on that it's really an improvement. So when we're trying to measure whether things are an improvement with the Kanban community, we try to look at actual results for the business. If we look at David Joyce's work at the BBC before he moved to Australia, he was actually able to show significantly increased revenues, and by significant I mean 600% levels of increase in revenue taken through advertising from their website because they were capable of delivering updates to that website much faster. So the question for your organization would really be, how willing are people to adopt something like Scrum? And if they're enthusiastic and they're gung-ho about it and passionate about it, I would say go ahead. If your existing process is particularly chaotic and it's difficult to map it, perhaps there's a lack of discipline. Lots of stakeholders are able to just reach into the organization and ask their own pet developer to build something for them. And what's needed is just some basic core process discipline. Then perhaps Scrum is also the right choice. If, on the other hand, many people feel that the current process is basically working, but perhaps not as well as they would like, then the more gentle Kanban approach might be a better place to start. So it really comes down to the emotion within the team and the organization. If people are enthusiastic for dramatic change, provide them with a dramatic change, and if they're fearful and resistant, then Kanban's perhaps a gentler way to make progress.
Excellent. Michael, hope that answered your doubts and questions. And I guess, David, that's a great introduction to people who are already familiar with Scrum and are looking at Kanban or looking at both of them together. We have come across a number of situations where customers are in some traditional method, they may be using waterfall or iterative or something which is not agile, and they're considering agile at this time, and they're not sure where to start because they're now hearing all of the different names, and they want to first be educated about everything that's possible within agile, and then of course make their choices of how they want to approach the whole thing. So I think your answer really spoke very well to that. I have a question now from Ramesh Patel, and Ramesh, you're on. Could you go ahead and ask your question, please?
Yes. Is my mic on?
Yes, it is. And you might want to speak a little louder.
Right. Okay. David, the question I have is, say I'm using iterative or primarily, say I'm using Scrum, and I have this comfort zone of being able to say, okay, at the end of this, iteration, I'll be able to deliver so much, and this is sort of when it will happen, which is, if you're in Scrum, you know the velocity, you know how much work to take, and when it will be delivered. In Kanban, instead of the velocity metric, we have CFD, and the question always comes up, how do I relate somehow my ability to forecast the delivery and you know, how to interpret the differences in the way the metrics are collected. Primarily, I'm trying to understand how CFD relates to velocity and things like that. That gives people somewhat more comfort as they're transitioning.
Hi, Ramesh. Yeah, it's unfortunate that the internet's full of poor quality information, misinformation, and deliberate disinformation. Certainly over the years, it has been true that several people have reiterated what you've said. It never came from me, and I don't think that you'll hear any other leader in the Kanban community suggesting that velocity is not important. I have read that many times, and to me it's really quite bizarre that people would say that. But, the suggestion is coming from people who either are not paying attention or are deliberately feeding disinformation into the community. The bottom line on a cumulative flow diagram, so the completed line, the derivative of that line is the velocity, and therefore it's visually obvious from the picture, from the graph itself. It would be good if the tool vendors provided a report on velocity, essentially the derivative of the bottom line on the CFD. And if you trace back through my own work over the last decade, there are actually many examples of such velocity graphs being reported. And as recently as conference presentations that I gave in January this year, I had velocity graphs in my presentations. The other issue is, when is the release going to happen? Well, that's not any different from doing something like Scrum. If you do a release every second Wednesday, then you continue doing releases every second Wednesday. The challenge is to know exactly what's going to be in that release. And frankly, I find very few Scrum teams that are actually capable of consistently hitting sprint commitments. And if they are capable of doing it, they're achieving it by massively padding the commitment with buffers and contingency for variability. The velocity data we observe on real teams typically varies by a factor of about 1.4 times to 2 times above and below the mean. So, for example, if we see a team with a velocity of 20 story points per sprint, actually their velocity is varying between 10 and 40 story points per sprint. And therefore, making any kind of prediction based on velocity over a short time period, such as 2 weeks, it is really impossible. So what tends to happen is most teams miss their sprint commitments about 50% of the time, and actually that's the way it's designed. The guidance to use something like average velocity to define the capability for a sprint and to make a commitment on it is really flawed. You can't use an average. And even using a 2-point spread, the spread of variation is so large that coming up with a reasonable prediction is very difficult. So one of the early observations that Donald Reinertson made about the Kanban system that we had implemented in 2007 is that it made what he called a late binding commitment. In other words, we promised a release every second Wednesday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but we didn't bind the commitment in terms of what would be in that release until the Friday prior, or 3 working days before the release. Of course, it's always useful to have some idea of what is more likely to be delivered in a release. And a combination of tracking velocity from the CFD and understanding the distribution of the lead times for different types of work and different classes of service would enable a project manager to make a prediction. And the latest version of Swift-Kanban has some good reports to help with that level of prediction. A recent trend that I believe will be commercial in 2013 is to use simulation software. And my former enterprise architect, Troy McGinnis, who also lives here nearby in Seattle, he has released simulation software, and I know that the Swift-Kanban folks are in some discussions with him. And I'm fully expecting a number of the Kanban vendors to embed simulation software into their products within the next 12 months, and the product will actually be able to predict with a high level of probability what is likely to be available in any particular release. I really think that the inclusion of simulation is the killer feature for Kanban, and it's the thing that's going to break open a really large mainstream market. And what Jeffrey Moore described as a tornado, which is the rush that happens after crossing the chasm. I think many people in the industry are going to find that Kanban software with simulation solves many of the predictability problems that they've been living with for an entire career.
And Ramesh, hopefully that answered your question. Thanks very much for that. Ram, I believe you had a question for Dominica. Why don't you go ahead and take on that?
Sure. So Dominica, this is a question for you, primarily for DevOps. In DevOps, people use applications like Remedy and Zendesk and things like that. So the question normally asked is that how do I adopt Kanban, and how do I leverage the Kanban tools in conjunction with Remedy or Zendesk? What are your recommendations? What have you seen?
Hi. Well, actually, I think there is an enormous opportunity for somebody right now to develop an interface between some of the ticketing systems that many operations teams are using and some of the Kanban systems. Right now, we're not aware of any good tool out there in the market that provides that kind of interface. And so it is a big question for teams. Especially distributed teams, they see the value in physical boards and want to get the visibility from the boards, but yet they have their existing ticketing systems, and they may also be covering a very high volume of tickets that come in. And so for them, this variable task size comes into play, where the transaction cost or the overhead for creating a ticket in the first place to put on their Kanban board is higher than the value that they get out of it. What we are starting to see are some exceptions to that rule. We're starting to see teams identify and recognize while they can't get every type of problem entered into their Kanban system, they can at least identify the high-risk items. So maybe if an item, it might only take 15 minutes to fix, but if there's a dependency on it, then maybe they have a policy that requires they create a ticket. Other exceptions would be, is this something that only one person on our organization can do? If that's the case, then we need to create a ticket for it so that we can cross-train other members of the team. Or essentially, if it's something that we want to measure, then we know we need to find a way to track it. Just because it's tiny doesn't mean it's not important, and if team members are spending the bulk of their day working on small, tiny tasks, and those tasks aren't tracked anywhere, then that means most of their work is invisible, and we are trying to bring visibility to a lot of that invisible work. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, America. That, yes, does. Thank you.
And actually, it's a very interesting question that we see come up with a number of our customers, and as a result of which we are doing these integrations as we go along with the roadmap for Swift-Kanban. We released our integration with Jira earlier this, actually about a month back, and we're seeing some great response from Jira users. We're looking at some of the other tools that were mentioned, like Remedy, Zendesk. We're even looking at non-help desk type of tickets, because the same problem exists elsewhere. So we're looking at, for example, Salesforce, and looking at other collaboration tools like, and I'm missing out the names of other tools that we have, Microsoft tools for collaboration, which essentially allow you to provide a solution to one of the other problems that Domenica, you talked about. One is of visibility. How do you make sure that everyone is aware of what are the items of work at this point in the system, and what is happening with them? So purely from a visibility perspective, a Kanban tool gives a great capability, but also in terms of measurement of metrics to see how effectively are you dealing with a sales order, how effectively are you dealing with a policy claim, how effectively, what are the lead times, what are the velocity with which the overall department might be working, whether it is a sales handling department as well. So whether it is help desk, or whether it is sales, or whether it is other functions, there are similar challenges elsewhere. Another sort of opportunity that seems to get talked about is just providing the visibility to senior management as well as to customers. So allowing the customers to come into the Kanban tool environment, and being able to give them a quick view of where a ticket is, or where a particular support issue might be. All of those are very valid examples of how a Kanban tool, in conjunction with a Remedy or a Zendesk or other similar tools, would be able to work. David, a new question that's come up from JP, and JP says that his current environment is rather noisy, so he's putting this question on the Q&A, and this is related to the question that I saw being discussed on the Kanban dev group just a few days back about looping. JP's question was that what happens to work that gets rejected in, let's say, a testing phase? If you send the work back to the previous work phase, this may exceed the work limit of that work phase. In addition, when you're moving work back, my metrics for that work phase may no longer be correct. How do I get the metrics on rework? And in general, I think the question revolves around how do you handle rework? How do you handle loops within a workflow or a value stream?
Thanks, Mahesh. First of all, for the audience, JP is another executive with Digite and Swift-Kanban, one of Mahesh's colleagues. And yes, surely this question must come up in every Kanban class that I teach, or Domenica, or Mike, or for that matter, all of the accredited Lean Kanban University trainers. I know that they share the fact that this question comes up with me often. It's clear that if you send a ticket backwards on a board, it may break the WIP limit in the place where you're sending it back. And that's just a natural dynamic of the system. There's never a right or a wrong answer about should we send tickets backwards or should we leave them in place. In fact, really this is quite an advanced topic that I have to cover in my 3-day advanced class designed for coaches and managers leading Kanban initiatives, because the choice and the number of available choices are incredibly contextual. And I believe that in the book I talk about the story from 2007 where I was approached by some managers who worked for me and said, we need to know what to do with bugs. Should we send tickets backwards to queue for development and bug fixing, or should we leave them in test? And if we do that, then the WIP limit will be full and the whole system will come to a stop. At the time, Corey Ladis and I discussed it and decided we wanted that stop-the-line type of behavior. The development managers discussed it and decided that for their teams they would rather send the tickets backwards and break the WIP limit so that only upstream activity was stalled and that development and testing could progress. 6 weeks later, so I allowed them to make that decision. It was their choice. They were running their own departments. But 6 weeks later, they were back in my office telling me that they were changing their mind, that they would rather leave the tickets in test and fix the bugs immediately and effectively stop the line. And I described the intervening 6 weeks as a significant improvement in the organizational maturity, that during the 6 weeks intervening, they had been continuing to flow work through the system and effectively coding against broken tests, something that would be unacceptable to an extreme programming team. So they discovered, or they learned the lesson when they had pushed completed work into the staging environment and they were expediting a few final bug fixes in order to get committed work delivered in time for a release. And when they pushed those bug fixes into the staging environment, they broke lots of other code which had been fully functional because they'd been testing against, or they'd been developing against broken tests, and they'd suffered regression effects. So this taught them firsthand that it was not a good idea to delay fixing bugs, that it meant that the system was carrying a number of assumptions and therefore carrying a certain amount of risk. And the idea that we had to run essentially a fire drill within less than 24 hours before a release in order to fix a significant portion of code that many had believed to be working correctly, that was an experience they didn't want to repeat. So they changed the policy. So the critical thing to understand is that a decision to send tickets backwards or to leave them in place is a policy decision, and the managers have the authority to control that policy decision. And the correct policy is contextual. If your team is not ready or your organization is not ready for that stop-the-line type of behavior, you shouldn't impose it on them. If I had imposed it on them in 2007 because I believed that I was the superior being, they would have resented me for it, and they may well have passively aggressively resisted the imposition of it. And it would have undermined my authority and leadership of the department. It would also have undermined the authority and leadership of the development managers. As soon as I, as the more senior manager, overrode their choice, I'm effectively reducing them to a mere supervisor of individuals rather than a manager of a department. So the policy thing and the context thing are very important, and understanding the subtlety and the differences in dynamics between different choices is really a complex topic that would require running some simulations perhaps in order to demonstrate the alternatives. Then there was a supplementary question of how do you deal with the metrics? How do you treat the lead time, for example? Well, I think lead time is really unaffected. If you were trying to measure local cycle time within, say, development, and something was looping back through development several times, I think I'd want to accumulate the total time in development rather than the time for each pass, but I could make an argument either way. I know there are some issues with the visualization in cumulative flow diagrams when tickets go backwards. And that creates a certain noise in the signal on the CFD. I think that that's just an inevitable reflection in reality, that if your CFD looks noisy because tickets are going backwards often, then that's probably a reflection on the maturity of the process and the capability of the different functions in the workflow. There is one exception to all this, which is processes that are deliberately designed to be iterative in its original meaning, the meaning that Alistair Coburn particularly promotes, which is that something is designed to be reworked, that it's designed to have multiple passes. And the original definition of an iterative process comes from Barry Bain, the spiral model. So where there's a spiral model approach where something is intended to be iterated upon 2, 3, 4 times, then perhaps you want to design your Kanban board to reflect that. And one of the ways that we coach people is to use different lanes on the board for different passes on the iteration, or different loops on the spiral. There have also been some physical boards. Carl Scotland's presented some photographs where the physical board was designed more to look somewhat like a dartboard, where the tickets actually move around in a spiral and the complete is actually the bullseye in the middle of the picture. That, of course, is probably more challenging for a software tool like Swift-Kanban, but we've certainly seen people do it with physical boards. So by doing multiple passes in multiple lanes, you can track metrics for each pass individually. But I consider that to be more of an exotic example. I don't find a lot of organizations that are deliberately using a spiral model iterative approach, because I think there's a poor understanding of the value of doing multiple passes in that way. I think the extreme programming community understands it very well. And you know, perhaps some of the system engineering community that's more widely adopted the spiral model. But apart from that, I really don't see a lot of heavily iterative development. What I see is time-boxed incremental development, and the Agile community misappropriated the word iteration when we used it to name these time-boxed increments.
Great. And just to kind of go back to the initial question about the ability to handle rework, I know that we've had at least a couple of clients who, you know, based on their standard processes that they used, which were CMMI compliant and more focused on quality, from a sort of more traditional, you know, perspective, they put a lot of effort to tracking work as regular work or rework, and I think they had a number of metrics that they wanted to measure from a rework point of view. So we had some very interesting discussions with them around designing a Kanban board that specifically tracked rework. So again, you know, a very interesting area of work or area of software development that and IT especially, that a lot of companies want to track. David, a number of questions have come up on the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask you those. And from the way the questions have come up, very, very typical themes. People looking at adopting Kanban and facing questions around concepts that they find it difficult to get their hands around. Before I go to the questions, though, I just wanted to remind all the attendees on today's conference that you can follow along the conversations on Twitter and look at what people are saying about the webinar and the topics that are being discussed. And the hashtag that we're using for this is DJA. So if you look for that hashtag and follow the conversation there and post your own tweets, that'd be fantastic. So David, one question that we have talked about a number of times, and I think a few people in the audience would be interested to know that, is what are the pros and cons of estimation? How do you deal with that in Kanban?
That requires the clarifying question, what do you mean by estimation? I hear the word estimation used a lot by people adopting Agile methods and by, let's say, leaders in the Agile community, and they're using that word to disguise what was formerly called analysis. And I believe that that's a tribal reaction because they consider analysis to be part of the 20th century problem and not the 21st century solution. So if we're talking about estimation, in other words, how long will something take, how much effort is involved, that's a separate question from if we're talking about analysis. So it really requires a clarification on what does estimation mean in this context.
So since the question came on text, I'm going to wait to see if they will respond to that. So I guess typically the estimation really is about the amount of time it will take. How long will something take to finish?
Yeah, so my reaction to that, how long will something take to finish, is study what has previously happened and use that data to provide a probability that will predict the future. One interesting metric, and this came up on the last town hall meeting, is that people in the Kanban community, consultants working with clients and coaches around the world, will often have their client track the amount of engineering time spent versus the total lead time for a work item, such as a user story moving through a workflow. And the results that are reported are really quite enlightening, shocking almost, because 5 to 10% is a typically reported number, and 15 to 20% is often a high-end number. In other words, it's not unusual for only 5% of the total time for something to be completed to involve a human being touching it. And therefore, when you go to the human beings and you say, how long will this take you? They might respond and say 2 days. But if that 2 days is only 5% of the total, then your 2-day estimate will be wildly wrong. That actually it's going to take something more like 40 days to complete it. And therefore, I find that asking the human beings to make some prediction of how long they think something will take, it is a low leverage activity. Because even if they're very good at it, even if they can give you a very high probability that their 2-day estimate is in fact accurate, it will have very little bearing on the total delivery time. And from the Little's Law equation, we understand that average lead time and the quantity of work in progress are the things that affect the velocity. So we're worried much more about the lead time through the system than we are about the length of time the human beings might spend working on it. So I personally feel that estimation is a low leverage activity where it involves asking human beings for an opinion. I will probably write an entire section of my advanced Kanban book on this topic because there are a number of other observations to do with the probability and the distribution on lead times and fixed delivery date class of service and the concept of an optional exercise point in real option theory. But that's way too complicated to try and get into in a webinar like this. But the bottom line is that if the engineering time is typically in the range of 5 to 15% of the lead time, and asking human beings for their opinion on how long the engineering time will be, and we know that that opinion is often erroneous with a factor of perhaps plus or minus 2 times, then actually asking their opinion is a low leverage activity. There's an interesting observation I have from a well-known Kanban implementation in Brazil, Alison Valley's Fidelis company. They actually outsource the sizing of the work items to the customer. The customer is allowed to submit a work item and say whether they believe it's small, medium, or large, with the rough guideline that small is less than a week to deliver, medium is less than 1 month, and large is greater than 1 month. And the customers are remarkably good at doing this with something like a 98% accuracy. And this would suggest that people on the outside are actually better at making comparisons of a request for work and how long they observed such a similar looking request to take previously than the people on the inside. The people on the inside are looking at the effort, whereas the people on the outside are looking at the actual lead time. And really what Fidelis are doing is asking their customers to perform analysis, to examine a work request and determine some level of complexity that it has. And actually, such a simple scheme as small, medium, and large, with very simple guidelines of lead time of less than a week, lead time of less than a month, or lead time of greater than a month, actually turns out to be very useful, very acceptable to the customers, and provides sufficient flexibility is the wrong word, sufficient contingency perhaps, that Fidelis is capable of delivering within those commitments very reliably.
So that's a fascinating story, David. I mean, I think it's a great way to get the customer involved in making that difficult decision about how long will something take. And at the same time, I guess it is the customer who's probably the most familiar with the business complexity of whatever is being worked upon, and so they are probably the best people to do that estimation. I think it's something to keep in mind for providing as a best practice.
Yeah, so it's worth commenting, Mahesh, that the Agile community has ritualized estimation activities or analysis activities disguised as estimation. And by ritualizing it and by making it part of the role and responsibility within a title like product owner or scrum master, it makes those activities part of the individual's identity, and it actually reduces the likelihood that they'd be willing to give those activities up. It actually creates inertia. By designing processes that have defined roles and those roles have responsibilities, you generate inertia that will increase resistance to future change. So if estimation is not working, the individuals are more likely to try harder to do more of it. And the more it doesn't work for them, the harder and harder they will try, because it's a core piece of their identity. And they're very unlikely to give it up. So rewinding back to a core Kanban principle, which is you start with what you do now, and you respect initial roles, responsibilities, and job titles. If you're already doing this stuff, Kanban is not telling you to stop. But my wider body of knowledge is telling you that logically what you're doing may not be valuable. And there will be a dissonance between the logical reasoning and the emotional acceptance. And therefore, I expect people to continue to perform this estimation for quite some time to come. I believe what will make it go away once and for all is the inclusion of simulation software in the tools.
Absolutely, and I think we're seeing some demand for that already coming in the context of Kanban and obviously for other tools as well. Very sort of related topic here, and you mentioned both the terms lead time and cycle time, David. So just for the sake of clarity, would you define what each of them means?
Yeah, so I think this came up on the last call, and it's probably, we should just schedule it for every call. So the term cycle time is ambiguous on a number of levels. Cycle time is meaningless unless you qualify where the cycle begins and ends. Whereas we could really create a standard definition for lead time, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So we could say, for example, what's the cycle time through development? And we'd be interested in when a ticket entered development and when it was completed. So cycle time in that instance would be a local measure of the time to pass through a development activity. It wouldn't include analysis or perhaps user interface design or testing. It would only be the coding by the developers. But we could also say the end-to-end cycle time, and from that we might mean entering the input queue to actually delivering to production. And in that instance, we'd really be equating it to the lead time. So cycle time needs to be qualified. It's typically a local measure. And to add to the confusion, in manufacturing industry and industrial engineering, with moving assembly lines, cycle time is used to refer to the length of time between an item, a piece of work such as an automobile coming off the end of the line. So if Toyota was saying we produce a Corolla every 90 seconds, they would say the cycle time on a Corolla is 90 seconds. But the lead time on making a Corolla from the components first entering the factory to the integrated and complete car rolling off the end of the line is actually 17.5 hours. So actually in that sense, the cycle time is actually the reciprocal of the velocity or the throughput. So if you're making one Corolla every 90 seconds, you're actually making 40 per hour. And from those numbers, if you know that the lead time is 17.5 hours and the throughput is 40 per hour, you can actually work out the quantity of inventory that's inside the factory, the work in progress in essence. So cycle time is an ambiguous term, and lead time it can be much more specifically defined. So For service-oriented work, and I'll be publishing this definition on the Lean Kanban University website probably in June, once we get past the Boston conference and I have a little time on my hands. From the point of commitment to the point of delivery. And for major project work, we will define it as from the point of commitment to the point when it's ready for release. So when it's sitting in the release ready buffer waiting for everything else in the major project to be complete. The point of commitment is the point that you pull something into the input queue on the Kanban board. The point from which the work in progress is limited downstream.
Great, makes sense, and I think that is in line with what we are trying to do in our own engineering operations, where once things are ready and they're waiting for the next release, they no longer should be contributing to a metric like that, while we wait for all of the items that we want to make in a particular release ready, so that the release can be made ready.
It's probably worth commenting at this point that one or two of your competitors are collaborating with you to define some of these standards and to ensure that tools like Swift-Kanban report the metrics in a consistent fashion. And we're hoping that we'll publish that standard within the Lean Kanban University over the summer.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, David. So yes, we are looking forward to, and we are participating in, and look forward to that sort of standard come out, so that we can, and as will others, be able to claim compliance to a certain basic set of metrics, which then makes their adoption and their understanding to the users much more easier as well.
Right, and I see the emergence of such standards as another element that will help Kanban cross the chasm and enter wider mainstream adoption. Mainstream buyers will feel much more comfortable when they realize that there is a standard and that there are a number of vendors all supporting that standard, and that there's some consistency and consensus across the community.
Yeah. I have a question for Domenica. Domenica, this came over the chat as well, and this is probably a little more high level about DevOps in general, and DevOps as an area of sort of focus and domain expertise or subject matter expertise has come about in the last maybe a couple of years. You probably have better understanding of that, and it was meant to bridge the gap between development on projects on the one hand, and the ops or the infrastructure guys on the other hand in a typical IT organization. My question is, does Kanban facilitate that bridging of the gap better than what might have been out there so far?
Yes. From what we're observing, we're seeing that gap between development and operation begins to break down due to the visibility that both teams have of the overall workflow. One thing that's been helping with that are these ops reviews that are occurring, where the entire team can come together and look at each other's set of issues and trends and the data that's coming out, revealing problems on both ends. When teams can understand the issues that are coming up that are impacting business value, that bring, that due to that transparency, we're starting to see more trust being built up between the teams. Additionally, when developers have to carry the duty pager and they're the ones that are getting woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning, the attitude shifts a little bit, and we've observed that the response and the accountability that the development team will take on can actually improve the quality overall of the whole organization. I think the key factors that Kanban is playing on DevOps teams is bringing the teams closer together by having a bit more of a generalist workforce. Of course, there's still a lot of specialization out there, and there may always be some specialization out there given the nature of the demand of the work. But in general, we're seeing an overlapping of roles and responsibilities starting to occur. In general, we're starting to see what were previously smaller teams that didn't speak to each other and were located on different floors or on different states or in different countries, even now working much more closely together and talking to each other a lot more and seeing each other's metrics.
Yes, yeah, that's a great great answer. I think the underlying themes are just overall collaboration, visibility, and an understanding of the challenges that exist on both sides, and therefore be able to work through them much better.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more point to that. That I think there is a true understanding now amongst many of the people practicing DevOps, in that the work is not done until it's up and running in production. This idea that we're done when we just hand it off to operations is no longer accepted. It's really not done until it's working in production. And even then, we're still not really done because that has to be maintained. We need to train people, we need to document things, we have to maintain this living system. It just doesn't end when it's delivered to production. It needs to be working and thriving and providing business value, and we need to keep monitoring that. It's part of our role.
Makes sense, absolutely. Till the customer signs off on it and they're happy, the work isn't done. So with that, I think we're coming to the 90-minute mark. And David, what I wanted to do was, put one last question to you, which I think everybody on the call today would be interested in, and that is, how do you overcome upper management resistance to Kanban? And obviously, you've spoken of that a number of times, and perhaps in today's call as well, to some extent. But I think that's a nice sort of closing question to talk about as teams try to take Kanban to the enterprise.
So obviously, we're looking for a quick answer here. My key observation about senior executives is that they're not emotionally vested in the processes performed by the company, unless it's a very small company where they were actively doing the work themselves relatively recently. So senior managers have their own set of concerns, their own emotional fears, and they're usually related to predictability, risk management, and being able to make promises to people, colleagues, customers, shareholders, analysts, particularly if it's a public company. If it's a public sector organization, they're worried about the wider political situation. And therefore, they have their own set of fears, and when you want them to buy into the adoption of Kanban, you should address those fears directly. So Kanban will help improve your predictability, the delivery predictability. It will improve visibility and transparency, which senior executives like. They often feel that too much data hiding by middle managers prevents them from intervening early enough to make a difference, and that they only hear bad news late. Kanban takes that problem away, so improves transparency, improves governance, improves predictability, and enables them to define policies which are better aligned with the risks the business is managing. The Kanban system and the visualization can be designed to directly expose risks that are being managed, such as developing a product to service different market niches, different customer bases. So better risk management, better predictability, more transparency, better governance, these are all things that senior managers worry about, and Kanban can help them improve all of those things. And then the icing on the cake is Kanban asks you to start with what you do now and to embrace the idea of evolutionary change and developing a cultural approach to process improvement and performance improvement in the organization. And to, I hate using that word performance, but senior managers like it. And to initially respect initial roles, responsibilities, and job titles, and really reduce the barrier, reduce the resistance, lower the barrier to introducing change, and to make change management a much more successful activity, and to truly institutionalize changes. So many senior people will have lived through multiple change initiatives in their careers and seen many of those change initiatives fail or produce lackluster results. So Kanban addresses that concern. So I really feel Kanban is very easy to sell to senior people. It's very non-threatening. But there is one aspect that culturally can be challenging for companies. Kanban asks managers to actually manage and to rise up to their responsibilities and to take action. And if they're not willing to do that, if there's a culture of hiding and inaction and managerial inertia, then they will not respond well to the cultural approach that's embedded in the Kanban method.
Thank you, David. I think that's a great set of input for management for them to consider adopting this. And I think with that, I'd like to close the event for today. Thank you so much for the great discussion today. Thanks to you, David, and thanks to Domenica. I would like to apologize to the rest of the attendees that we couldn't get on Mike Burrows and Janice as much on the call today because of some audio issues, but hopefully we will have more discussion in the future where we'll all be able to participate. Just again, a reminder that we will be sending a follow-up email with links to the webinar recording and to the slides. And we'd love to hear from you. The contact information for both David Anderson Associates and Digite are on the screen here. We'd love to hear from you with feedback on the webinar itself, as well as any other follow-on questions that you might have on Kanban or Swift-Kanban. That'd be great. Thanks a lot again, and goodbye.